Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora e tiwi. Hey, welcome in to The Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host, along with fellow co-host Peter Bale in London. Peter, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Bernard. It's 6 a.m. I'm hoping that the sun is going to come up just enough so that, if necessary, we can see fantastic Mr. Fox, as we did, I think, last year.
Oh, yes, that would be exciting.
When the fox ran across the back. In fact, was there two foxes, I think? Were there two foxes?
There seemed to be a double act, and they were very show-offy, and it was fantastic.
I was thinking of George Clooney and Meryl Streep, of course, in the TV version of Fantastic Mr. Fox, and that's who I think of when I look at them. But we also, if I open the window open the door behind me in a minute, we might be able to hear one of the Ospreys or helicopters of Air Force, Marine One, flying Donald Trump across the city from Windsor Castle.
And we will wave very nicely at him and say very lovely things, because you are travelling back to New Zealand through the United States.
That's right. Thanks, Bernard, for raising that again. Yes, thank you. Yes, I am. Yes. I am doing that. And
because the United States is turning into quite a contested space at the moment. Jimmy Kimmel, another late night host, has been claimed by Donald Trump's views on how good they are, it seems.
Yeah, well, I think, Bernard, that I'm the only person in your entire friend circle who dislikes virtually all of those late night American television hosts. But yeah, Disney has pulled the plug yet again and caved to the MAGA forces and the Trump forces and pushed Jimmy Kimmel off the air indefinitely because of remarks, not so much about Jimmy Kimmel, actually, about Charlie, not so much because of remarks about Charlie Kirk and the assassination of Charlie Kirk, as the extent to which, as he put it more or less, the MAGA movement is capitalizing on the assassination of Charlie Kirk, which is, one would have thought, an inarguable fact.
Fair comment, I would have thought.
Yeah. So
you're right.
This extraordinary pressure against him. And I was listening back to our podcast of last week, our edition of last week, Bernard, and really I was working on the fly, but I mentioned a likely attack on George Soros as a result of this, because the moment you start talking about the leftist forces the dark leftist forces who might have been behind the assassination, and of course, particularly J.D. Vance has talked about George Soros, his extraordinary organisation, the Open Societies Foundation, and also the Ford Foundation. They're two of the largest non-profit contributors in the United States to small L liberal causes, including media. And again, they're lying constantly about what those organisations have funded. So we're going to see some very dark attacks on what are called leftist forces. And although we still don't really know the motivation behind the alleged killer of Charlie Kirk, although it would appear to have something to do with transgenderism and the extreme views that Charlie Kirk expressed about that.
That's right. Just before we bring in Catherine Dye a little bit early today, my recommendation for dystopian thrillers to reflect this moment in time, The Handmaid's Tale actually is a cracker.
Yes.
But secondly, The Plot Against America from Philip Roth.
Absolutely. We mentioned that last week. We're living in it, Bernard.
Yep.
I mean, just let me mention one other thing. I am flabbergasted, or have been flabbergasted over the past week, to see David Seymour and Winston Peters entering into this Charlie Kirk discussion, mourning his passing, which of course is perfectly all right to acknowledge the awfulness of an assassination of a political figure. But the extent to which this just instantly comes through to New Zealand and fires up the right wing, and this idea of free speech and hate speech and so on. And I was struck that Sam Stubbs, who's most definitely a friend of this show, the head of Simplicity, had to withdraw and apologise for one of his tweets about Charlie Kirk, which again was condemning the killing, but noting that Charlie Kirk was a purveyor of hate speech. And it was interesting that one of the organisations that appeared to have pushed Sam into having apologised was the New Zealand Israel Institute, which itself is one of the great little trolls of the New Zealand internet.
Well, he's hoping you get through the States and back to New Zealand nice and safely, Peter.
Thank you, Bernard.
Catherine, lovely to see you. Thank you very much for coming on early today. The Australians, who previously have been laggards on the climate front, seem to be leapfrogging us at the moment. What have we heard from Australia? There's been a couple of big pieces of news in the last few days.
Yeah, well, the first is their putting out their national risk assessment, which is a really fascinating document. It's got some quite strong news in it, which has been quite impactful and has then been used to justify stronger targets, which they've also just released. In terms of leapfrogging us, I'd say, we actually did a national risk assessment document in 2020, and it is built into our climate change response legislation that we have to do one every 6 years. And so there's another one due out here next year, and the Climate Change Commission is currently working on that. So we did beat the Aussies in terms of getting one out. But I would say that it's got a slightly different tone in terms of the way it's facing. And one of the things that the Australian one did quite well, I think, is that, they've got a bit more kind of quantitative modelling and numbers in there, which, you could argue is more or less useful. But they've also got a lot of language in there that speaks to compounding and interconnected risks. So they're looking at how risks can cascade and how they can, and the ways that they're connected and what impacts that can have. And that's quite new sort of language and quite interesting, and is really kind of an advance, I would say, on what our first round of that report was. So in terms of their target setting for 2035, that's the other interesting bit of it. So their government has come out today, I think, to say that they are targeting a 62 to 70% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. That's a long way ahead of where we're at. Where they were sitting before, they were already sitting at, I think their current target is around 43% cut by 2030. So they've put in quite a big advance for their 2035 target.
Yes, but is it enough? Because we know that we need to really, really get those emissions down if we're going to keep warming to anywhere near 1.5, 2 degrees. Because it's interesting, they're now talking openly about what 3 degrees would mean for Australia.
Yeah, that was one of the interesting things in that report, right? So they looked at, what a 1.5 degree world would look like, what a 2 degree world would look like, and what a 3 degree world would look like. And so there were quite strong impacts associated with that. I think, with their range that they're targeting for 2035, there's actually quite a big difference between the bottom end of that range and the top end of that range. So apparently 62% reduction in 2035 is associated with a world that is still hotter than 2 degrees, whereas that 70% is starting to bring it a bit more into alignment with where they kind of need to be going. So yeah, it could be even stronger. And the other thing, of course, is that it's only not that long ago that the Australian government approved the expansion of their gas fields, like the Gorgon gas field, and the amount of carbon emissions associated with that when that gas is burnt elsewhere or combusted elsewhere is staggering. Like, it's a huge amount of emissions. So there's a little bit of, things aren't entirely aligned.
Yeah, the gas lobbyists in particular in Australia are very strong. Australia, up until a couple of years ago, was one of the largest LNG exporters in the world after, I think, Qatar or one of the Emirates. The United States is doing an awful lot of gas exporting now. And interestingly, that's Donald Trump's, one of his hopes is that everyone will buy American LNG. And one of the things he's really grumpy about is that China and India are buying an awful lot of Russian gas at the moment. It really is something to keep an eye on what the Australians are doing. It's interesting too because electricity is a big part of the Australian story. They have been mostly coal-fired until recently. They've done an awful lot of solar. And in New Zealand, we're going to get in the next couple of weeks the government's response to this desperate plea to reform the electricity market and really get cracking on going renewable. What should we watch out for on that review and some government action?
Well, I think the big question mark is whether there's going to be a bit of just tinkering around the edges, or whether they actually go for proper market reform of the gentailers, in line with things like breaking them up, and also changing the structure of pricing. So one of the issues, obviously we've got at the moment is that the wholesale market price is based on the most expensive supply, which is usually what comes out of Huntly, and then everybody gets that price, and so that enables quite a bit of profit making by some of the gentailers, especially the ones that are running cheaper energy. But of course the government is a recipient of some of that profit, so there's some mixed incentives there. I think the other thing that could be quite interesting is there is a suggestion that we ought to be using some of the lakes as a form of battery storage rather than a form of profit-driven, business making, basically. So as you grow your renewable energy and bring those more solar and wind energy online, you could use our existing hydropowered lakes as a form of battery. But that would take some really serious changing of the market in order for them to be used that way, because that's, would shift them away from being focused on profit making.
And did the previous government have a plan to do exactly that, to create a hydro battery, as it were?
Yeah, they had the plan for a massive pumped hydro at Lake Onslow.
Yep.
Yeah, and the current government threw that in the bin as soon as they came in. So that was still being explored as an option, and it got thrown out by the current government. So that kind of then brings you more into this territory of, well, we could just use our other lakes as battery storage, our existing ones. So you've still got these discussions around how do you deal with the dry year issue, how do you create sufficient storage for the future, and that's still a live conversation, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting now that the big hydro gentailers, Meridian and Contact, are looking to use existing lakes more by essentially allowing them to be lowered. So this is essentially another environmental economic trade-off, or they would say, instead of burning gas or coal, we'll lower the lakes. And Lake Pukaki is the one that Meridian is looking at, and Lake Hawea is the one that Contact is looking at. And of course, locals are worried, rightly, that if those lakes go too low, you create all sorts of biodiversity damage. But secondly, Lake Hawea, for example, has been low in the past, and dust storms have been created and created all sorts of grief for farmers around there. So there are trade-offs, and even though it looks like a quick hit, it could be painful. It really is a test of this government's will and its real intention to improve the market and improve affordability. They've talked a big game about being all about reducing inflation for households in a time of stress, but they haven't actually done much, and that will be the real test.
Yeah, and I gather those proposals, they've just forwarded them to the fast track legislation process. So that's, a sign of where they're thinking of going. There's a lot of pressure on Lake Manapuri as well, I gather, for their, and they already, have something like 95% of the water stream from there goes towards hydro. So.
Yeah, and particularly now that it's been worked out that electricity until now for New Zealand has not been something that we could export. We're just too far away from everywhere. But by turning electricity into liquid aluminium and then exporting that, and also powering data centers, in effect, you are making electricity in export. And unfortunately, that's one of the ways in which there's upward pressure on prices. Catherine, thank you so much for coming on. Great to see you. And we'll talk again next week.
Thanks, Catherine.
Great.
And welcome on to Robert Patman.
Good evening. How are you?
Great.
Good, Robert. Are you firing on all cylinders today? I'm hoping to have the Fox on again as the sun comes up here in London. So you might be competing for attention from the George Clooney of Belsize Park.
Okay. I'll
Well,
you're the George
Clooney of Otago, as we know.
I haven't quite got to the silver grey stage yet, but I'm sure I will.
Yes. And Robert, I sent you a little list of things yesterday, and writing it, I was thinking, and I haven't done this, but I need to do a bit of a word cloud on the number of times that the word threatens is associated with Donald Trump in a given day. So he's launched a second attack on Venezuela, or on a Venezuelan boat. He's threatened the European Union over its Russian oil imports. Threatened
which he
Vladimir
declines
Zelensky.
He doesn't lead by example though. He
Correct.
says to the NATO countries, unless you stop buying, or the EU countries, unless you stop buying oil from Russia, then I won't follow suit, which gives him because he knows full well Viktor Orban and the Slovakia government plus the Turkey government are not going to stop buying Russian oil, particularly when it's so cheap.
Correct. So what do you think? I mean, he's here at the moment. I was saying at the beginning of the show that we may even open the door and be able to hear his Osprey or Marine 1 rather, fly over to the US ambassador's place nearby in Regent's Park. I mean, this is an extraordinary sort of visit. Weirdly, of course, although he's spoken overnight at dinner at Windsor Castle, he's been strangely quiet, other than slagging off Jimmy Kimmel, as we said at the top of the show. What are you making of the current sort of Donald Trump week, particularly ahead of the main UN General Assembly meeting next week?
Well, let's just say I think Mr. Starmer has taken a huge political gamble, because this is, if you like, fawning diplomacy in full bloom. He's pushed out the boat for Trump. Unless Trump can deliver politically for Starmer, Starmer is going to pay a big political price for this, because it's no secret that many British people already don't like Mr. Trump. And many will reluctantly say, if this is what we've got to do to get better trade terms with a very isolated Britain after leaving the EU, or relatively isolated. I know it's it's now part of the Comprehensive and Progressive Partnership, but Trans-Pacific Partnership. But Britain is looking for obviously expanded markets, and the Brexit people pinned their hopes on a really good free trade agreement with the US. So far, that hasn't really come through. And Starmer's hopes tomorrow to make a breakthrough. He also hopes that while he's got Trump softened up, so to speak, and still, glowing in the royal
I was going to make a rude segue there, but Robert,
he will probably hope to have a chat with Trump about Ukraine and Israel. But again, I personally think that Starmer has taken a huge political risk. I don't think the way to treat Trump is through flattery, because I think Mr. Trump, by next week, a lot of that would have receded and he'll move on.
It's interesting also, but Robert, the other thing that Starmer's dealing with, of course, is the fallout from, which I don't think we discussed at all last week, for the fallout from Peter Mandelson being fired as British ambassador to Washington.
He's linked to the Epstein factor.
Because of his links to the Epstein story. So, a politician has lost his job as a result of the Epstein files, but it wasn't, in fact, a US politician, and it most certainly wasn't Trump. It's this odious little prince of darkness.
The whole Epstein thing continues to haunt Trump. I think he's privately really concerned about this. It's very interesting that MAGA supporters have reminded the administration that the best way to honour Charlie Kirk's memory is to honour one of his last pronouncements, which all the contents of the Epstein file should be laid open for the American public, and there should be no holding back. So again, there's a lot of pressure there on Trump in the background. Trump is a lot of bluster, but I think Trump's a weak leader. He's not actually. I mean, he's completely passive, even, that's putting it strongly, when it comes to dealing with Netanyahu and Putin. He clearly is never going to move against Putin. And sooner or later, the penny is going to drop in Europe. They're desperately trying to wait for Trump to have this sort of change of mind, which they think, Putin's intransigence will eventually force the president. I actually don't think it will.
It seems too, Robert, that on the latest issue of sanctions against Russia, where Trump has come out and said, I'll only sanction Russia once all of the Europeans have sanctioned Russia, which from a politician and a movement who are very critical of Obama's so-called leading from behind way of doing foreign policy. This is quite a thing. Basically, I'll only sanction Russia if you do, which essentially basically just reveals his lack of real intent and ability to use his power to try to stop the war in Ukraine, which is concerning.
Yeah, it's concerning, but it's not new. And, Mr. Trump still continues to come out the narrative that Zelensky bears some sort of responsibility for what happened. By the way, just before he jumped on the plane to get to the UK, he said once again that Zelensky's in deep trouble. He's been saying that virtually every week since he got into. He said he's in deep trouble. He'll have to make a deal. Well, actually, as we were speaking about in the last Hoon, Russia, another big strike in the last 36 hours. I think it's one of the biggest oil refinery sites in Russia, 8 miles out of St. Petersburg, got struck by over 300 drones.
Wow.
So that means now Russia is close to losing 40% of its oil refining capacity because of these relentless strikes on its energy infrastructure. There's two facets to that. Not only will it complicate Russia's ability to sustain the war, or the invasion, we should say, of Ukraine, but it will also, and it is having big effects on its ability to even meet its domestic market for oil, let alone sell it externally. And that, of course, Russia is completely dependent on the sale of oil. And so it's very interesting that Mr. Trump still continues to put that spin that Zelensky must do a deal basically on Putin's terms.
Yeah, Robert, on that oil issue, it's becoming clear now that Russia was forced to divert its oil from Europe and the rest of the world to somewhere else, and it's gone to India and China in particular. And China is also taking extra gas from Russia, and the Europeans have effectively forced the price of Russian oil down to $47 a barrel, which is $20 less than the main oil price for the world. And what it's meant effectively is that China now has an energy cost advantage over the United States when it comes to manufacturing. So Trump's idea that he's going to rebuild American manufacturing
through tariffs
has meant that his own actions have made American manufacturers less competitive, and he has improved or advanced the competitive power of China's manufacturing because of his lack of action on those sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And I think a lot of American economists have been, how should I put it, increasingly shrill in their criticism of the domestic effects of the tariff program that Mr. Trump has rolled out. I do think many liberal democracies, including our own, could be a lot more robust in making the case for free trade against a very protectionist Trump administration. But yeah, I mean, it's another issue which may feature in the discussions between Starmer and Trump in London, Chequers, I think tomorrow, may well be the Palestinian situation as well, Gaza. And I don't think that there's going to be any meeting of minds there, particularly after Mr. Rubio, the Secretary of State, has just spent 2 days visiting.
Let's talk about that a little bit, Robert.
Visited the Secretary of State, America's top diplomat, visited East Jerusalem, an archaeological site in East Jerusalem. Now, remember, East Jerusalem was illegally annexed by Israel. So, in effect, the top American diplomat is basically recognizing Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem. And given that Mr. Trump seems very comfortable with Netanyahu's plans to take full control of Gaza and also the far right's commitment to annex the West Bank, there seems again to be another area where there's going to be divergence between Europe, or at least some significant European leaders and the Trump administration.
And Robert, aren't we being set up for a really huge confrontation at the General Assembly next week? Because we're going to see France, the UK, a number of others trying to recognise or vote to recognise the Palestinian state. We've had that rather weird Rubio visit, and now we've got this attack on Gaza City, the most heavily populated area of Gaza, even if we think
it's a pity that New Zealand's government didn't make its position clear on Israel's military offensive against Gaza City, where 1 million Palestinians have nowhere to go and where they're taking large numbers of casualties on a daily basis. And we're talking about civilians. So it's a pity that our government can't give a clear moral stance on that issue, or even a political stance. And of course, we're still, New Zealand's position on Palestinian recognition is yet to be revealed. Apparently that will be revealed in New York. Apparently they're waiting.
It's probably
for
being made up as we speak.
Information they still need to make a decision.
What is going on there?
Just 1 second, Robert. Sorry, if you don't mind. I just want to ask you also about, we had this UN panel, and our usual friend Polygraph is talking about, in fact, the West Bank being not annexed but liberated, which really started to piss me off, actually. Robert, well,
on that basis, Europeans in America would have to return to Europe and hand over to Native Americans.
Yeah. Robert, this UN panel this week that determined that genocide was occurring in Gaza, that Israel was guilty of genocide, and also brought in, for the first time, the president of Israel, as largely ceremonial role, but the president of Israel amongst those that are accused of presiding over genocide. Obviously, it doesn't have the same weight as the ICC out of The Hague. But what did you make of that additional
there was something
verdict?
that probably carries more weight, and that was the International Association of Genocide Scholars, which includes, by the way, very eminent and prominent Israeli scholars. And 87% of them concurred on the 2nd of September that genocide was actually happening in Gaza. So there's been a sequence here, and in a sense, that organisation has in the past been often regarded as a bit of a go-to on issues where there's a suggestion of genocide or not. So they're quite an authoritative organisation, some of the top specialists in the world on genocide. What can we else say that has not been said on this awful issue? The thing is that, and we keep saying it, the thing that really comes home is the fact that the UN Security Council seems to be so paralyzed on this issue, and it's a tragedy in many respects, and I think we're going to pay a big price going forward.
And what about the position that I know you have to go in a moment, but the thing Bernard was just about to ask about, which is the New Zealand perspective on this. As you say, it's held back about whether it's going to recognise Palestine next week. Are you expecting New Zealand to change its position, and are we being set up, in fact, for a huge controversy?
Well, we've always wanted a two-state solution. And we've always said, this is Mr. Peters, not me, that there is no military solution to the conflict in Gaza. Given those statements, and given that Mr. Peters insisted the UN Security Council, which the US has cast the veto more than 5 times to prevent a ceasefire, he said that the UN Security Council has failed. Given all those statements, I would be very surprised if we did not recognise a Palestinian state. But politics can be full of surprises, of course.
Well put, Robert.
Thank you very much, Robert. Speaking of surprises, today
Robert.
thank you very much. Speaking of surprises, we had a GDP surprise today, and we're very lucky to have Craig Rennie on the line with us after the shock result, a 0.9% fall in GDP in the June quarter from the March quarter. Lovely to see you there in the passenger seat.
I thought, like Christopher Luxon, I would come to you from the from the seat of the limo, but in this case, it says Subaru and Pretzer on the way around Wellington Base.
Oh, you can do some burnouts. That's great. So, Craig,
You're putting, as usual, you're putting the car into Kaka.
Craig, tell us about the numbers. What did you think of 0.9% down?
I mean, it's pretty appalling. The Reserve Bank was forecasting minus 0.3. We saw the big banks forecasting minus 0.4 each. That was ANZ and Westpac. What we saw, the Treasury at the budget was forecasting 0.7% growth.
Wow.
So we're miles away from where we were. Nobody was forecasting minus 0.9. That's an enormous fall. That's a 4% year-on-year fall if you compound that out for the rest of the year. But when we look at the data almost makes it worse, because manufacturing fell 3.5% in just 3 months. Mining fell 4.1%. These are really big falls. These are COVID level falls in the data. And what it suggests is that it's not just some one-off event, because 10 of the 16 sectors of the economy saw declines in growth. And that's saying it's really broad-based. It's also suggesting that it's not just because of tariffs, as has been claimed elsewhere. This is a broad-based slowdown in the economy. And if I can give you one final statistic that just really delivers it for me. Over the past 15 months, we have been in negative growth for the 9 of those 15 months. So this isn't just a one-off event.
So what's caused it?
The honest answer is there's lots of things that have caused it. We've seen falls in domestic consumption. We saw business investment fall in plant, in equipment, in transport equipment purchasing. We saw a 1.9% fall in construction, and particularly in residential construction. So there are broad-based falls. The only bright point was there was some household consumption, but that household consumption, again, was pretty muted. So it's not one thing that's caused it. To be honest, the confidence has been sucked out of the New Zealand economy. If you go around town telling everyone that you've got to stop spending money, you've got to stop investing, and there's no money left, guess what? People stop spending money.
And we've also seen that freeze in investment spending on housing, hospital planning, school building. Now, some of that's been unfrozen now, but it's come home to roost in the form of 15,000 construction jobs or so that have left. And also the rest of the manufacturing sector. I mean, we've had another mill close in Tokoroa this week, on top of the Carter Holt mill closing in Nelson. And a bunch of other pulp and paper mills closed in previous months. It's been a winter of discontent for manufacturing, not just on the, not much demand from New Zealand buyers, but also a gas problem, it seems, as well. So what do you see here for the government's current strategy, which is to just tighten their own spending and not do anything else?
Well, the challenge here is that the government is pinning its hopes on the Reserve Bank cutting interest rates until essentially the wealth effect returns and people feel wealthy enough to start investing in new things. That's not going to work if because the Reserve Bank can't keep cutting interest rates if inflation is going to start rising again. Inflation's 2.7%. It's 3.2%. Food pricing is 5%. Electricity pricing is 11.4%. Part of the reason these businesses are closing is because there's a real challenge with energy in New Zealand, and there's no plan to address that at all. There's no investment to address that at all. And so de-industrializing on that side, not this is part of the reason why we're seeing the big fall in goods producing sectors in the New Zealand economy, which saw a 4.9% annual fall in this data.
So let's put you in charge of economic policy, Craig. You've been parachuted into the 7th floor. What would you do right now to turn it around?
One, I would stop giving the money away. So we've had $23 billion in tax cuts over the past 2 budgets. We've seen public sector cuts over the past 2 rounds of budgets. The prescription is not working. Let's stop relying upon the Reserve Bank to deliver growth. Let's instead deliver some investment, some stimulus. We can build state housing, solve the 20,000 households on the wait list, solve the 16,000 fewer workers that we have in construction, and
I got a feeling this Subaru and Pretzu has just gone
into Victoria Tunnel.
No, if we're... Am I back?
Yes, you are. Thank you, Craig. Now, just one thing. I'm going to channel Nicola Willis now and say, where on earth are you going to get all that money from to pay for all this, things you're going to do? There isn't any money left.
Well, again, just don't cut $23 billion out of your revenue base then in tax cuts, which we've done over the past 2 budgets. But also, we're not short of investment space in New Zealand. Our debt levels in comparison to our international peers are tiny. There's plenty of things that we can be doing. And in fact, the cost of not borrowing and solving those problems is actually greater than the cost of borrowing. So it's actually costing us real money to not invest and not solve those problems.
Craig, interestingly, a former Minister of Finance, Roger Douglas, came out today and criticised Nicola Willis. What did you make of his criticism, which is essentially this one of confidence and not doing anything to promote growth? And are you concerned, and let's just also be clear that you're a trade union economist, are you concerned about the independence of the Reserve Bank? So Roger Douglas, then Reserve Bank.
I think in terms of Roger Douglas, I'm loath to be in the same position as Sir Roger on pretty much any issue. But in terms of whether or not the finance minister goes or changes or does anything, I think the key thing is what is the fundamentals doing in the New Zealand economy, and we're not getting those right. We're not investing in R&D. We're not investing in infrastructure. We're not delivering growth in sectors that we want to see grow in the future. So let's get that right. And let's inject some confidence into that space with some long-term investments in those spaces. In terms of the Reserve Bank, I think we all have an interest in making sure that we have an independent Reserve Bank, and that importantly, it's seen to be independent, not just appears to be independent. I'm not sure how much that's going to be making much difference to people, the 50,000 more people who've lost their jobs since this government came to office.
But what about the dollar? Just 1 second, Bernard. What about the dollar and New Zealand's debt position? I mean, are you feeling as though, are you believing that might be in jeopardy? And also, most importantly, are you wearing a seatbelt, Craig? Because people are very concerned.
I think you just put it behind, right? I am indeed wearing a seatbelt.
Excellent.
I can definitely guarantee that.
People are very concerned about your safety.
No, in terms of it's very heartwarming. But in terms of the dollar, the biggest challenge to our dollar in the long run is a poor economy, and not getting the growth that we actually need. We can keep lowering the interest rate, which will also lower the dollar's value, but I'm not sure that we can do that at the same time as make sure we keep inflation within the target band. The real risk in New Zealand is that we end up in a horrible place like the 1970s in the UK, where we end up with stagflation, where we end up with inflation and a stagnant economy together, and nobody wants to be there. That's why we need a different plan.
But isn't it time too, Craig, to actually question the fundamental, way that our economy is run, which is to essentially run it to keep inflation low, give the Reserve Bank independence and control of monetary policy, when it's clear now, 35 years in, this hasn't worked. The Reserve Bank got its forecasts wrong. It hiked interest rates too high and hasn't cut them fast enough. can we really afford to have an independent inflation targeting central bank that prioritises inflation over jobs?
I think we can afford to have an independent reserve bank that does target both inflation and, to me, as someone who supports a dual mandate, would also target full employment as part of that mandate, because you don't want to lean too heavily just on the inflation lever. But I guess the key thing for me is that sort of one of the things you raised quite rightly, Bernard, is that we haven't had a decent economic plan that has involved fiscal policy and the use of the government's fiscal tools properly to actually deliver full employment and industrial policy. And we haven't had that for 40 years in New Zealand. We don't do workforce planning. We don't do development in the way that we should do. Those countries that we want to look like, those countries that do things better, do. And perhaps we need to take some lessons from them rather than assuming that we know more than they do.
Craig, it's been wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much for taking us on a trip around Wellington and
buckle up.
But buckle up and not doing any burnouts in that Subaru Impreza that you have there. Thank you so much for being on the show. We'll talk again maybe after the next quarter when we get 2 consecutive negative quarters.
We've got a Hoon on the Hoon. Yeah.
Great. Well, it's time now for our next guest to join us on the show. We are very lucky to have with us the former co-founder of 2 Degrees and the man behind Monopoly Watch, Tex Edwards. Great to have you, Tex.
Good afternoon, Bernard. How are you doing? Thanks for inviting me.
It's good. Now, this week has been a big week in the Monopoly watching game because the government has announced what it says are the first major reforms to our Commerce Act and the rules around competition and monopolies in 20 years. What did you make of those reforms?
Positive, good step, shows comprehension by the Minister and Cabinet that there is a clear and present problem. I just don't think there's acknowledgement of how serious the problem is. Essentially, in one sentence, the horse has bolted. These big monopolies in New Zealand have big barriers to entry and are entrenched, and reforms around market structure are required. It doesn't matter how much love and kisses you give supermarket regulation, you need to do a breakup. The banks are out of control in New Zealand, and we continually are embarrassed as a country that we've got the most profitable retail banks and no neo-challenger banks. I'm sure a few of your listeners have heard of the internet, Bernard. Have you heard of it? Well, essentially, government officials haven't heard of it because we're the only country that doesn't have internet-only banks, which removes the profitability from the big four. I quite liked the initiative. I respected the words of wisdom from the minister that what needs to happen. However, I had a couple of lobbyists call me up and laugh at me and say, oh, it's all been watered down. Tex, you're nicked. To which I said, you're absolutely right. It's been so watered down. Our submission was that we have a designation of what market power is, and we have a designation of significant market power. We've reached out to the minister and suggested that they hire the central bank governor from Denmark or Sweden, not from New Zealand. And we suggested that the chairman or chairwoman for that matter, chairperson of the central bank, the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, should be an international because we're just too cozy here.
To tell us about that coziness, what you're suggesting there is that, yet another outbreak of attempts to reform our situation and break ourselves free of all of these monopolies and quadropolies and duopolies has been effectively captured, wrestled to the ground, watered down by a whole bunch of lobbyists who we don't regulate. Can you tell us a bit more about how the lobbyists work and what's wrong with our current setup there?
Yeah, thanks. Well, excellent question. Thanks for that. Because this week, there is a prime time fabulous example of what's happened in Australia and what's happened in New Zealand. And in Australia, the ANZ Bank has been spanked by the regulator and fined $250 million. and being told off for invoicing dead people, but really unconscionable conduct inside their treasury operation, and seriously obvious being nasty and abusing their relationship with government bond tenders. But what's really interesting is that the regulator has told off the directors, and it's not inconceivable that they could force a change in directorship of the ANZ Bank by the shareholders. And the same board members exist on the New Zealand board as Aussie. We called for the New Zealand board members to resign from Australia when the scandal first broke. And it's noteworthy that some financial analysts think that the entire board could be up for re-election.
Could you remind us, Tex, who the chairman of ANZ is in New Zealand?
Well,
I think I've forgotten.
Sorry, today it's terribly pleasant chap called Scott St John, and it used to be the chairman of the cabinet. He was chair of the cabinet, the prime minister, and so that after he finished being prime minister, he joined the ANZ Bank, and there's been actually a real quarantine in the report that, particularly by the financial community, the independent analysts that look at the governance of ANZ, because it's a problem that's gone on for 20 years. So there's quite serious governance issues there, but really what's most interesting, and nothing personal about the board, but if you're on the board, you've got to take responsibility, and you've got to poke your nose into that dealing room environment. But what's really interesting is that in Australia, they've been fined 250 million. In New Zealand, they're up for a private prosecution from some litigation financiers that could cost them 250 million or 500 million. But they've actually got lobbyists to submit retrospective legislation to unhook any accountability that the bank would have. And what's happened here is that as you've turbocharged profitability in this mortgage lending cyclone, people have forgotten what governance is, or forgotten what the social license of the bank is, and really it's been abused. So quite a contrast, Bernard. And to your point, the lobbyists have got hold of the legislative process and put before Parliament and persuaded all the officials that do policy, and persuaded them that it's okay to do retrospective legislation on an abuse. What's really noticeable to the trained eye is that if you analyse the Commerce Commission independent market study, you'll see actually the big banks admitting that they've underinvested in systems and that they can't cope with open banking systems, which is really 15 years behind the rest of the world.
There's been some great work done by Bryce Edwards on calls for reform to our lobbying situation, or at least some form of regulation. What sort of regulation could we do to try to soften this problem we have of our democracy being captured?
It's endemic. You'll notice that Sir Geoffrey Palmer has just recently published a book called Fixing New Zealand Democracy. And actually, I've just come from the bookshop with my young child, and actually catalogued every time he mentioned lobbyists. Mm-hmm. In one sentence, we need an OECD-style lobbyist register, point one. We need documentation of every lobbyist encounter by officials and by government. And we need an absolute clear and present policy on stand-down periods for government officials going to the private sector and the private sector going to the government. And there's some really cataclysmic disasters here, and I think people are embarrassed by it who've actually got sucked in and forgotten what common sense is. There was a very well-respected politician who was the chairman of cabinet. He's Prime Minister of New Zealand about 5 or 6 years ago. And then he went to be the ANZ chair without a stand-down period, outrageous. And at the true level, it's the shareholders who have ESG policies who don't allow that political interference into their board. And so it's a breach of shareholder ESG protocol to let that happen, point one. Point two is in Europe, if you're a media journalist and you're a frontline media opinion leader like a frontline political reporter working for a public broadcaster, there's a 2 or in some countries 3 year stand down. So when you have the chief political reporter in New Zealand from the government-owned TV station join the lobbyist team of ANZ Bank with just a weekend break, you're breaching best practice rules, and you're also breaching common sense.
That is such an interesting perspective, Tex. Thank you.
Yeah.
Tex, just one final question from me. We're going to have another test of the government's will on actually reforming the electricity sector next. We're going to get the Frontier Economics report out in the next week or two, and the government has said it's going to do something. The smoke signals from various ministers, I must say, have been pretty weak. But, what should the government do with the electricity sector to make it more competitive and improve affordability of electricity?
Well, point one, prove to the public that they're serious, which they need a structural remedy, not a behavioural remedy. No more spanking or telling off people, but they need to force divestment of the retailers just to give the signal that they've turned up for work, right? And it's unacceptable that the head prefect of the electricity companies, there's 2 head prefects, or I think they call themselves CEOs. They've come out, they just sort of administer the monopoly, but they've come out and said that it's not going to make any benefits if they divest retail. But simply put, you need something that captures the imagination of capital providers who can deliver solar and wind. If you look at solar and wind, it's under registered, we're under captured, we're under serviced in those asset classes. And if you look at the situation carefully, you'll see that there are financial incentives for the electricity producers to create scarcity, to drive the price up, because they're the producers. It all goes to the bottom line. And if you look at their return on equity after you've taken out revaluations, you'll see that they're some of the most profitable hydro players in the world. And Jeff Bertram catalogued in his report quite nicely where New Zealand was in relation to Norway 30 years ago, because we had all this lovely cheap hydro, and what it meant for consumers in New Zealand to where we are today. So you only need to track down executive remuneration, share price appreciation, and see there's a little game being played here. Again, it's breached the common sense test. And in my view, the Electricity Authority needs to be staffed by Norwegians. I'm serious. Danish, and possibly some Finnish, just like the central bank, because we actually have a problem here, and it's cuddle the lobbyist, which is the problem.
Yes, there needs to be a flat in Wellington where the former governor of the Central Bank of Denmark and the former regulator from Norway get together in Wellington and reform our economy. Just finally, there is one example in New Zealand's modern political history where we have actually taken action, and you're in a particularly authoritative position to talk about this. 2008, Telecom was broken up into Chorus and Spark. The Commerce Commission and the government worked together to clear the path, make it easy for people to switch from one mobile network to another, reduced mobile termination rates. And you, as one of the co-founders of 2 Degrees, watched up close and personal, if you like, a proper breakup and fostering of competition have a huge effect on not just customers, but our economy. How does it feel to watch it work in one sector and then the rest not do the same?
Well, I think it's noteworthy that the telecommunications adventure took 10 years, not 10 months. And I was on record as a young banker when I was a kid, thinking that I could get the telephone company going in 3 months or 6 months. And in fact, I'd never forget telling the chap at Avis Rental Cars going, I'm just here for 3 months, I'm just sorting out my telephone deal. And quickly, the lobbyists backtracked on the must-have legislation. So things like number portability is really easy to understand. And number portability took 13 years to come to New Zealand. It was like 12 years late in coming. Things like the termination rates, interconnection, cell tower ecosystem, renting and sharing, and basic things like roaming. But those initiatives took like 9 years. They should have taken 9 weeks, 9 months. And exactly the same process is happening in banking. Banking is outrageous. There's Payments New Zealand is a closed network. It's very similar to telecommunications in that it has network effects. And the obfuscation is correct. And if you ever meet a lobbyist in a Wellington bar after 2 or 3 drinks on a Friday night, every lobbyist in Wellington slaps you on the back. Sadly, I've had actually back surgery. I don't know if you've heard about it. But they slap me on the back and go, "Hey, Tex, it's just the telecom playbook. Don't worry about a thing." And the telecom playbook is played out in banking. Really important that consumers of New Zealand understand that if we had a Danish open banking system, 42% of all banking traffic in Denmark is on internet-only neobanks, and that mortgages are 45 basis points over their OCR or over LIBOR or what we call the interbank rate. Here in New Zealand, most mortgages are circa 180 to 220 over OCR. Of course, it's confused, and of course, the banks will do a haka and basically come out and say confusion, and make themselves try to be publicly acceptable, saying it's somebody else's fault. But their story doesn't line up with their profitability, because it's their profitability that exposes the nonsense. So quite a long way to go. Pertaining to the telecom breakup, Bernard, I think this election is going to be about who's got the biggest guts in the commerce portfolio, who's going to do the breakups and the split ups. And the public is just sick of hearing another, "We're regulating potatoes." No, we're not. We're regulating butter. No, we're going to have an inquiry into mincemeat. The common sense denominator has been pierced in New Zealand business by some of these larger monopolistic structures that are reliant on lobbyists and state capture. And I think that we could see a 20-country downgrade from Transparency International.
Wow.
There's a group working in Berlin embarrassing Transparency New Zealand, which actually has an old government minister as the CEO, and as the chairwoman. I'm sorry. No, nothing personal. It's just a process that's not working.
Yeah.
And Transparency International is actually funded by the government. There's no integrity in third-party verification. So quite an interesting time in the commerce portfolio, and these monopolistic structures are, if you're an economist, they have what is called the economic dead loss rate. So it's the extracting of these huge amounts of dividends that just go overseas that should be recycled through the economy. And when we did the 2 Degrees adventure, it was pride and joy of all the staff at 2 Degrees and the team and the shareholders, that the Treasury wrote a report calling the 2 Degrees effect of when they reduced the costs, it actually created a little bit of economic stimuli. And we originally were laughed out of town when we said, look, we're going to create something as effective as a 1.5% tax cut, and we're going to create 2,000 jobs. And we probably created like 3,500 jobs, and it was almost a 2% tax cut because that monopoly rent was recirculated through the economy. And when I was a kid, and I used to be a banker doing the telecom account, Telecom was a $20 billion company. Today, it valued in the stock market. It used to pay $2 billion of cash capital to its American shareholders. Today, it does like 300 or 400 mil, and it's only a $4 or $5 billion company.
So that's the size of the gain the government could obtain for customers and themselves. Essentially, a big tax cut. I don't think they're going to grab it, and I don't think Labor will either, because they certainly didn't do it in the last 6 years that they were in government. Tex, unfortunately we have to head off. It's just gone 6 o'clock. You were wonderful.
Thank you so much,
Thank you so much.
Tex.
Really, really appreciate you being on the show.
Nice chatting, and thanks for engaging in Monopoly Watch's portfolio. Much appreciated.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Jeez. Great to have Tex on board. Well, that was a cracking show, Peter. I'm really pleased about how that went. And I look in the background for the fox. I haven't
Yes,
seen
no, me
anything.
too. I'm waiting for George to come through. He's not
George,
there at the
he's got a
moment. Hang
name
on.
now.
Oh, no, it's a reflection. Yeah.
Yeah. He's got a name. Does he have a name tag, or like a
well,
little
no,
collar?
like I say,
or-
I mean, it's just because of George Clooney and the fantastic Mr. Fox that I think of the foxes out here as George, whether they're male or not. But unfortunately, my friends who live here have also stopped feeding the remarkable parakeets. There were hundreds and hundreds of large green parakeets in the back garden here. And there is a fantastic urban myth, which, forgive me if I said this 2 years ago when we did this from here, but there is a fantastic urban myth that the parakeets of Hampstead were originally released during the filming of Humphrey Bogart's Africa Queen movie at Pinewood Studios, and that they were released and formed this huge colony in Hampstead Heath. But I'm afraid it's an urban myth. It's probably just Mr. Budgerigar from Mrs. Tibbles up the road that actually led to this huge number.
And I see climate change has affected the London hosting parakeets. Peter, do you have a skateboarding dog?
Well, I do in a sense. I mean, and as usual, I mean, I should say last week I mentioned the oracle and one real arsehole called Larry Ellison. What I should have said as well is that about 3 months ago, at the prompting of a young person I know who asked me if I had a Sharesies account, I did in fact buy some oracle shares through Sharesies. So I should declare an interest in the, I mean, I'm not a billionaire like Larry Ellison, but I should have declared an interest in the story that I told you last week about Oracle being up. I think it's 130%.
Well, that will be why it went up. Yep.
Yeah. So my skateboard. Yeah, I've moved the market with my Sharesies account. Yeah. But my skateboarding dog is another one. It's actually within the realm of real stories, which is that there's a wonderful organisation in England, which unfortunately did not manage to stop Brexit, called Led by Donkeys, which has a very strategic sort of approach to projecting signs onto the sides of buildings which embarrass politicians. And so they've projected images of the Donald Trump letter to Jeffrey Epstein's for his 50th birthday, and pictures of Epstein and Trump together onto the side of Windsor Castle, which is pretty cool.
Genius.
But and this is the sort of crunchy bit of it. Several of them have been arrested for malicious communications. And this highlights something that's going on in the UK and that I think we need to think about in New Zealand, including about the Charlie Kirk business in a sense. There have been, the government here prescribed an organisation called Palestine Action, which is essentially, a bunch of little old ladies and professors and so on who go out and protest quite actively about the what's going on in Gaza, and more people have been arrested in Palestinian Action now that it's been proscribed as a terrorist organisation than were arrested at the fascist right-wing St George protests led by Tommy Robinson and his New Zealand helper Brian Tamaki in London last week. So there's some pretty weird unbalances in what we're thinking of as free speech at the moment, I think, Brendan.
Yes, and no wonder Keir Starmer is facing a potential revolt from his own backbench and is about 15 points behind the Reform Party in the polls.
I'm afraid, Bernard, he's toast as far as I can see. He's toast.
Well, we should watch this space. Peter Bale, co-host of The Hoon in London. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host of The Hoon here in Aotearoa. See you all again next week. Ka kite anō. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.